it's interesting you state in the report, government programs, whether they're successful or not, often overshadow grassroots movements that are building economic alternatives and supporting communities in transition.
One is in terms of filling gaps. And we see this from the labor movement. There's a lot of good examples, but in community organizing too, where there are government transition policies, but they are either too narrow or inadequate. And then the community kind of steps up to fill in the gap. So we've seen this around worker training in some of the fossil fuel sector, where yes, government transition programs exist, employment insurance exists, but it's not enough. And then it's local organizers who are stepping up to support workers, helping them find new jobs, find new training, things like that. But the more kind of radical potential is where community organizers are coming up with new ideas that then governments take on. They'll build a whole bunch of awareness around an issue. They'll start organizing around an issue. They'll start doing planning around these issues. Like, what do we want our community to look like? And then higher levels of government see that and they're like, oh, that's actually a good idea. Let's fund it and then take credit for it.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications of Sierra Club Canada, and today I'm going to be talking with Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood about how communities can play a big role locally in the transition to renewable energy, regardless of what the federal and provincial governments do, by taking control of local energy. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us. Hadrian, thank you for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So for those tuning in, who are you and what do you do?
Well, my name's Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood. I'm a senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. It's a nonpartisan public policy think tank. But in practice, I work on basically kind of the intersections between climate and the economy and social justice. So I kind of feel like I've got sort of one foot in the labor movement, one foot in the environmental movement. I guess I got a third foot in the academy, that sort of thing. So I'm using kind of academic methods, but trying to make that work useful in the real world. So I spend a lot of time talking to environmentalists about why they need to care about the economy. Spend a lot of time talking to workers about why they need to care about the environment.
That's got to lead to some interesting questions because, yeah, it is funny how those two dichotomies become so prevalent sometimes in the conversations that we're having, where on the one hand, we're trying to talk to workers about why the environment is important. I think actually, funnily enough, like we think about the economy almost continuously in everything that we do, at least at the club, right? Like we're always thinking about like what are the economic impacts of this because we've gotten so used to that being the immediate response to anything that we say is like, so we're thinking about that, obviously. But the funny part is, I think, thinking about the way other people are thinking about the economy can sometimes be like, what are they hearing and what concerns do we need to address, right? With something that's coming out.
Yeah. And I mean, what does the economy mean? So I find that there are certain environmental economics is a whole thing. And a lot of advocates like myself are often thinking in economic terms. We're often thinking in kind of big picture, long-term terms. So we're thinking there's no economy in a climate destroyed world, for example, like that framing comes up. We need to do this or else. But I think for a lot of workers, households, individuals, they're not thinking about 2100. They're thinking about the next paycheck, right? And so when we think about not just our messaging, but also the kinds of policies we're advocating for, we need to be cognizant of and respectful of those kind of immediate concerns around things like affordability.
Well, I want to jump into that a bit with our first question before we get into the report that you've put out. Because it is funny, right? Like if I'm thinking as, let's say, a future homeowner, right? Like I'm saving up to buy a house, right? Like, funnily enough, I would think about the climate, right? Like it would be one of the things, because I'm exposed to it, I'm in the industry, because I would actually be thinking, I don't want to buy in a flood-prone area. I don't want to buy where wildfire is going to, where I'm not going to be able to get home insurance, right? Like I'm actually aware, funnily enough, of like all of those individualistic things that we should be talking more about when we talks about, because again, there's that wide focus, what's the cost of the climate economy, and most of the debate that we seem to have about like those issues like housing, we talk about the costs of acting on climate change. But I'm curious, in the report you get a little bit into this, and I'm curious if you have other examples you can share. What are some of the costs of not acting on climate change?
Yeah, well, I'm going to jump right into dollar figures, but I know I want to acknowledge that like dollars and cents aren't what really matters. And what matters is our well-being. What matters is like the health of the planet and so on. And it's a bit crude to put that in economic terms, but as you pointed out, I mean, that's often the immediate criticism. That's kind of the framing that governments and industry take. So we sometimes get forced to take it on. But at like a very high level, there's different studies out that kind of show that in a kind of not even necessarily a runaway climate change scenario, not even like a worst case, but basically on our current trajectory, which could be 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century, the global economy would be basically cut in half. For Canada, that's kind of $1 trillion a year cost. And it ramps up kind of exponentially. So already today, we're looking at kind of $20 billion a year across the economy and climate damages. That's a lot, but it's manageable. And that's not manageable for the individuals who are affected, but it's manageable for the economy. We're
And
kind of
that's
on
each year.
track. Yeah, per year. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
By 2050, mid-century, we're on track for about $100 billion a year in damages. And then, as I said, by the end of the century, it's kind of 10 times that, a trillion. Like the number is so big, it almost doesn't matter. If we're experiencing climate disasters on that scale, like the economy couldn't survive it. Doesn't mean humans are all dead. It just means like the economy would fall apart. So that's the cost of inaction. And I don't talk about it to be dystopian. We have to put that cost in context. You know, when we're fighting over whether we could afford to spend $10 billion a year on public transit or something, like that number is like, no one would entertain it in government. $10 billion a year in extra funding for public transit would be so extreme. But in the context of not doing anything on climate change, it's quite reasonable. It's especially true for climate adaptation, actually, not just mitigation. So building things, you know, you mentioned flooding being a big problem, wildfires being a problem. Like there's steps we can take proactively to protect our infrastructure from floods and wildfires. But it's expensive and no one wants to pay for it, even though you get back. I mean, the last study I saw is you get like $13 to $15 back for every dollar you spend on adaptation. That's kind of the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure sort of thing. Anyway, this is all kind of like high level stuff, but too often, as you point out, when we talk about taking climate action, we don't think about the long term and it just is framed as being too expensive or unnecessary.
But that's very realistic. I mean, like in the sense of when you're talking about like the economy just not being able to survive that in the long term or even in the short term, having some serious issues. Like I do think that that's maybe something people can understand. We often hear the line on that same note that whenever we put out some sort of climate solution, right? Like we hear the line, well, the market will take care of it, right? The market will facilitate the transition to clean energy. And I'm not necessarily saying there's no truth in that. Like obviously the markets are actually starting to favor. We're seeing massive investments in renewable energies outpacing fossil fuels. But you've kind of said in your report, if we just left it to markets, that's going to be chaotic and it's not going to do much help for communities necessarily. Can you elaborate and explain what needs to happen instead and what you mean by that?
Yeah. So, as you point out, it's not that the market can't work. And there is certainly a world in which by 2050, we achieve net zero purely through kind of like a green capitalism that's exclusively focused on domestic emissions. It's like technically possible. There are a bunch of problems with that approach of just saying, like, come on, Bay Street, take the wheel, let's do it. So, a couple of them are one, we don't know that it's going to happen. So, when the state takes action, when the public takes action, we can use regulation, can we use other tools to ensure that the transition happens in the way that we need it to happen. A good example of that is the phase out of coal power in Canada, where the federal government said, here's the timeline. By 2030, no more coal plants, with some loopholes, but basically by 2030, no coal plants. That certainty changed the industry. And now you kind of let the market figure it out. You say, okay, you're these private coal plant owners, you decide what your timeline is for wind down, but you know what the end date is. If we just say, hey, coal plant owners, please wind down your plants when it suits you, maybe they'll do it, but I doubt it, right? So you need a little bit of a stronger hand and more intervention, especially on the regulatory side. But there's a whole other problem with trust in the market, which is that in this wonderful capitalist system we're a part of, the only thing that matters is profit. People don't matter, right? Communities don't matter. So in that green capitalism net zero by 2050 scenario, there's no guarantee that inequality won't be dramatically worse than it is now. There's no guarantee that communities won't be left behind, that marginalized groups are even more marginalized by that point. And so when we're talking about, as advocates, especially as progressive, socially minded advocates, we don't just want a zero carbon economy. We want an economy that actually makes everyone better off, that's more inclusive. I mean, a really concrete example of that is we know some of the communities that are at greatest risk of transition are small rural resource communities, coal towns, and things like that. Also, a lot of rural or remote indigenous communities. So if we just say Bay Street, take the wheel, build out a whole bunch of green manufacturing, where are they going to put it? It's going to be built in the GTA. It's going to be built in Calgary. Like none of that money is going to flow into the communities that need it. So that's why it's important to have public leadership so that we're thinking about more than just the profit motive, more than just raw emissions numbers, and thinking about how can we actually build an economy that works for everyone.
And I always say this is funny, but even for those people listening who maybe are like hyper regionalist or nationalist, even or something like that, it's always funny when they say, I don't want to develop any sort of green economy locally. It kind of leaves the future in the hands of somebody somewhere else, right? Like if you are somebody who's concerned about sovereignty, whether that's community sovereignty or whether that's national sovereignty or whatever, it's a bit weird not to want to have on some sort of localized basis an infrastructure that you actually control, that you have access to, that maybe your community directly controls their own power, right? Like
Yeah.
windmills, and isn't dependent upon anybody anywhere else to do that, right? Like
Well,
that's funny.
and these are some of the things I'm most excited about. And I mentioned rural and remote indigenous communities. Indigenous communities are right now some of the main leaders on building out small scale renewables or medium scale renewables. These are such exciting projects. When you have a rural indigenous community building its own energy infrastructure, it accomplishes so many things. One, it makes that community less dependent on settler utilities or on the import of diesel. So it's empowering that community. It actually creates often an export industry for that community because they can then sell power back to the grid and to other communities. And it also creates a whole bunch of local activity because you need people in that community who can build and service that infrastructure. To me, it's an economic win, it's a reconciliation win, and this is already happening in a lot of communities across the country. I think federal government, other levels of government need to provide more funding to these communities to build the infrastructure that they then own.
Right.
But it is starting to happen, and there's such great opportunity to do more of that across the country.
Well, okay, so you mentioned a series of examples actually of this happening in the report. For instance, Latrobe Valley in Australia, where a wildfire actually became the Dakota catalyst for a community to start a cleaner shift. This was partially a government-led initiative, but it's interesting you state in the report, government programs, whether they're successful or not, often overshadow grassroots movements that are building economic alternatives and supporting communities in transition. We often see radical activism, environmental activism of any kind being against whatever the government is doing. Is there a roadmap here for something maybe a bit more nuanced where communities actually instead look at what the government's doing, they see what's happening, and then they actually take that in the direction they want rather than what the government necessarily intended, which could be good or could be bad. I mean, I put that on a sort of a random spin the wheel thing whenever I see a new policy come out. But could other ways communities can actually look at government programs and actually be like, okay, yes, we're going to take this, but we're going to use it to build self-sufficiency. And what does that example kind of tell you about grassroots action?
Yeah, I mean, I think it says a lot. And we looked at in this paper a lot of different communities and what they're doing. I think there's kind of two ways to think about community organizing in this context. One is in terms of filling gaps. And we see this from the labor movement. There's a lot of good examples, but in community organizing too, where there are government transition policies, but they are either too narrow or inadequate. And then the community kind of steps up to fill in the gap. So we've seen this around worker training in some of the fossil fuel sector where, yes, government transition programs exist, employment insurance exists, but it's not enough. And then it's local organizers who are stepping up to support workers, helping them find new jobs, find new training, things like that. So that's one kind of community organizing, which is kind of like picking up the government's slack. But the more kind of radical potential is where community organizers are coming up with new ideas that then governments take on. And this is what I kind of mean in the paper by government's kind of overshadowing community organizers. Is it's often the case that community organizers will start, they'll have these initiatives, they'll build a whole bunch of awareness around an issue, they'll start organizing around an issue, they'll start doing planning around these issues, like, what do we want our community to look like? And then higher levels of government see that and they're like, oh, that's actually a good idea. Let's fund it and then take credit for it. So that
Yeah.
happens a lot. But at the end of the day, if you're an organizer, I mean, that's a win, right? Even if you don't get the credit you deserve. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that governments in general, and this is a huge generalization, but like they want to do things that are A, easy, and B, popular.
Mm.
And when communities take the lead and show higher levels of government that this is possible, that we've already done it, we've already created this program or built this community infrastructure that's reducing emissions and making people's lives better, we already know it's popular in the community, then that makes it a lot easier for governments to say, okay, sure, we'll help, we'll get on board and we'll help accelerate this program. So that happens as well.
Well, okay, so this ties a little bit into the next question because it's funny. I think sometimes I turn on TV to what is happening in the country and it feels like I'm watching a television program. It looks like I'm
Yeah.
watching a drama program,
Right.
right? And there's these functional things that communities either do or don't do, that policies either succeed at or don't succeed at, that communities either organize around or don't. And it feels like, quote unquote, politics of all of those things is often the theater above the economics and the policies that are actually happening. You know, an example in Kentucky where even though there was a lot of political divisions on things like renewable energy, people organized in an independent way to make change. And in Edmonton, there's another example that you cite where people developed alternative and parallel forms of social dialogue around these issues that maybe were separated out a little bit, could be engaged in those political discussions for sure, but were separated out from them at the same time and were able to create a healthier dialogue maybe. How did that happen and what does that look like in a practical way?
Yeah, I mean, the Kentucky example is so interesting, and it was really fun to get to look into it as we wrote this paper. And this organization, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, they've been around for 40 years. This is a really long-standing organization, and they do a lot of really interesting organizing. So one thing that I want to highlight from what they've done and what they've learned over the decades is that you have to empower yourselves. We sometimes forget that in a lot of organizing, in my experience in the environmental movement, where we're doing things like advocacy, but we're not necessarily kind of training and upskilling, taking a kind of a more kind of professional approach, which is what the Kentuckians for the Commonwealth do. So they train their members, they train members of the community, and they train them in terms of how to engage with the politics. So if you want your community to write letters or show up at a town hall, you don't just say, please show up at the town hall. You say, go to the town hall, and these are your talking points. This is how you answer questions. This is how you frame it. Providing that kind of support to members of their community to make them even more effective as advocates. And that kind of capacity building has been really successful for them. In Edmonton, I think it's Climate Justice Edmonton. It's a smaller organization. It's an interesting political environment. They're in a very hostile provincial environment when it comes to climate action, but not necessarily a hostile local environment. The municipal government of Edmonton has been something of an ally to them. And you have to be aware of the local circumstances always when it comes to organizing. Municipal governments in particular are sometimes the greatest allies and sometimes the greatest enemies of action. There's no one size fits all approach. In Edmonton, they're allies, and Climate Justice Edmonton works with them. But yeah, I mentioned a kind of parallel process because sometimes, and in fact, often with the governments we have in power right now, there's a lot of consultation happens in Canada. So people nominally have a chance to have their voice heard on important issues around energy and infrastructure. But it's not that those processes are a sham, they're just incomplete or highly controlled. And so what Climate Justice Edmonton has done is basically set up kind of a parallel process, doing their own kinds of organizing, their own kinds of talking to the communities and polling and engaging with the political process. And this is kind of the example I talked about earlier of kind of plugging the gaps of where governments don't go far enough. In all of these cases, though, it just starts with motivated members of the community. It's really what it comes down to is you need someone to take the lead. And then eventually you need some money to keep going. In its purest sense, organizing for its own sake is wonderful and ideal. But all of the most successful organizations we looked at ultimately end up with some funding so that you can have the capacity to really do this work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting you talk about those localized functional things that people can do. There's two other examples that you cite. one in Mexico and one in Ireland, where communities actually created counter maps for corporate renewable development, not just showing where projects maybe shouldn't go, but actually identifying opportunities for renewables locally the corporations hadn't considered that would be better. It's an interesting one because I actually did work in Ireland for a little while doing something similar. It was on bird conservation of all things, and was talking to farmers to try and get zoning laws more appropriately zoned and basically the process to be better for them so that basically they didn't feel this antagonism towards trying to save, in this case, a particular type of eagle, basically, that had been, I should say, hawk. There's a lot of definitions there. But anyway, that really strikes me as neat, as something that's very practical. I can see examples in Canada right now where if a community were to take that on, it would not only then give them a way to maybe push back against the elements of projects that they don't like, but to actually bring in some of the things they do want to have happen in a way that they have control over. Yeah, do you think that this is an option in Canada and where people may be mostly concerned about placement for these sorts of projects?
Yeah, well, so I think there's two elements here, and you touched on both of them that I think an important function of community organizing. So one is mobilizing local knowledge. When we talk about what kind of infrastructure or support a community needs, that community knows better than anyone. You got to ask them. And sometimes these kind of perfunctory government consultations don't actually meet people where they're at and learn from them and understand what a community really needs. It's more about, we've got this federal program or this provincial program. We have kind of a template for how it's supposed to be used for projects, and we want to kind of force it onto this community instead of starting with the community and saying, what kind of support do we need? You also, when you do that kind of work, you also learn about the history of a community, which is really important. So a lot of government programs are very much like, okay, how do we solve this problem now and looking forward? You don't reckon with historical injustices or historic inequities in the way that community organizers can. So yes, there's that local knowledge function is really important. And then the other, as you pointed out, is this alternatives function that community organizers can offer. So it's not just saying, no, we don't like that. It's saying, here's what we want to see instead. So mapping can be kind of geographical mapping, as you point out. So talking about like, what's really the best place to site a project? You have your criteria at the federal level, but here's what we in the community think would be most useful. But there's other kinds of mapping too. We talk in the paper about social mapping, which is an interesting exercise that some communities do, which is just trying to figure out who are all the relevant actors in this community on this issue. Who are our allies here? Who are the obstacles? Who can we work with? Who do we need to connect with? And doing that kind of exercise can really clarify for community how you move forward. And it also helps you feel less alone when you realize that there are a lot of allies in a community for advancing a socially just climate agenda.
And that's social mapping, because I think that's something that inherently, when I talk to most people in communities, they kind of know, right? Again, if they know the history of their community, they've lived their entire lives, they know everybody else and what their views are on things and maybe what they've dealt with historically. Or, people also just know that, again, back to Newfoundland and Labrador, right? Like people know where the best hunting spots are, and there are also traditional places for activities like hunting or fishing or trapping or various different activities that they've got that are only knowledge within the community. They're not knowledge to a corporation or a provincial or a federal government.
Well, exactly. That's exactly the kind of local knowledge that's useful for a community to come up with its own alternatives. How do we want to move forward as a community? And if you can engage members of the community, you draw on their knowledge, give them a voice, and then you can work together towards a positive future. It doesn't mean it's always going to be easy, of course. Like none of these transitions are easy and we don't want to sugarcoat it. But the more you can get people involved and thinking about where they came from and where they want to go, the more likely you are to end up with a good plan for a community.
Mm. You mentioned existing initiatives that help communities with the things we've been discussing here today. Are there any in particular you'd like to highlight to people thinking, I'd like to do some of these things in my community? I'd be interested in learning more.
Yeah, I wish I had a more positive answer. There are initiatives that exist. I mean, the paper we talked about some examples from the US, which is a little, I would argue, further ahead on this front. In Canada, we have a group called Community Climate Transitions Network, which sort of does this function. If a community decides that it wants to begin organizing, or there's someone in the community who wants to get things started, the Community Climate Transitions Network is a group that could help you do that. And then of course, there are all kinds of groups in this ecosystem, like the Sierra Club, like the CCPA, all kinds of environmental groups and social justice groups that you could plug into that can help you move forward. I talk a lot in the paper about the labor movement, not because it's the only ally, but because the organized labor movement is A, has a lot of capacity in general, and B, has been dealing with this idea of a just transition for a long time. A just transition being how do we make sure that workers aren't left behind in the transition to a cleaner economy? And so the labor movement has a lot of useful lessons, I think, to offer communities more generally who aren't just focused on people as workers.
Well, and that's an interesting one because another group that comes to mind is Iron and Earth, for instance, which is an association of oil and gas workers that are working towards just transition. I mean, our Sierra Club Canada Atlantic chapter has done significant work on renewable energy democracy, right, and those sorts of concepts and helping to provide at least some of the framework for that thinking on community level. Yeah, as you say, the capacity isn't quite there, but maybe there are examples too to look at in other places, right? The United States is not necessarily always that different than us in some of the common issues that we often struggle with. So it's neat to do that. For people who want to find the report and find out more, where can people access it?
Yeah, so the report we've been talking about is called Don't Wait for the State, which I co-authored with Max Coe and Isabella Pogener and Abby Lewis. You can find it at policyalternatives.ca. That's the CCPA's website. Everything we publish is free. We're a charity. And I also have a monthly newsletter called Shiftstorm. So I definitely encourage people to check that out. You can sign up at policyalternatives.ca/shiftstorm. And I write about exactly the sort of issue, everything about workers and climate in Canada.
I won't put a link to the report under the podcast. Anything else you'd like to say today?
Well, I just really appreciate having the opportunity to chat with you about this. I mean, I remain very hopeful about our future. For all of the bad news out there, for all of the big dollar damage figures I'm talking about and all that, I do see a growing awareness and a growing reckoning with this problem. And I think there's a better future ahead for us if we work at it.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Hobger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.